leader up for failure, and we set ourselves up for disappointment. Many of you know I'm a dean right now, so I like to remind myself that that applies to being a dean as well, right? That we set our leaders up for failure if we think that they are going to do everything and if we have no responsibility. Leaders are successful when there is a critical mass that works behind them, alongside them, and in front of them, right? And if we look in the past, if we look at the history of the United States, one thing that we will see is that the presidents who were in office at the time of greatest social transformations were in office when there were very powerful social movements, right? Lincoln had the abolitionists. Franklin Roosevelt had the labor movement and the populist movement. Lyndon Johnson, the civil rights movement. Reagan, the conservative and Christian right movements. All very different presidents. Ideologically, not on the same page. Not even all presidents that I would necessarily say I agree with. But what I will say is that they were in office at a time of significant social change. Right? John Atlas, the president and founder of the National Housing Institute, tells us, quote, Franklin Roosevelt recognized that his ability to push New Deal legislation through Congress depended on the pressure generated by these movements. And in fact, when Franklin Roosevelt was confronted with activists who were belaboring a point, Roosevelt said, okay, you've convinced me. Now go out and put pressure on me. Does everyone see? The next president needs a social movement behind that person, one that pushes a vision for social justice. And what I would argue is that the vision for social justice has and should have as its starting point the rattling of common sense. What makes a social movement powerful? It's that it changes how we think about things. It changes what is taken for granted. It changes common sense. And so this then gets to the second theme I want to talk about, common sense and the danger of a single story. Common sense and the danger of a single story. So, I grew up in Hawaii. Some of you might be able to hear the accent, but anyway. I grew up in Hawaii, and in the 1990s, I was visiting, and some of you will know that in the late 1990s, there was a referendum on the ballot to amend the Constitution. And the constitutional amendment was to give the legislature the authority to prohibit same-sex marriage. Okay, so the constitutional amendment that actually passed by a great majority of the voters in Hawaii, and it sparked a whole string of legislation and policies across the country that would prohibit same-sex marriage. Hawaii was the starting place for all of this. And in the build-up to this referendum, I remember seeing a full-page ad in the newspaper that the headline was, "It's just common sense." People were saying, it's just common sense that marriage is between a man and a woman. Of course we should amend the Constitution to prohibit same-sex marriage, right? And reading that reminds me of how we often talk to really young children when they're doing something bad, and when they're doing something we don't like. Don't we often look at them and we say, use your common sense. Like, stop doing that. Use your common sense, as if common sense is a good thing, right? And those of you who know my writings will know that I've written a lot of things that say, no, common sense is not always a good thing, right? Common sense is what helps us to socialize many different people into the context we find ourselves in. Common sense is what helps to maintain the status quo. Common sense isn't the seeds of transformation. Common sense, in other words, is often the problem. This reminds me of how, those of you who are studying the history of education, you'll know that about 100 years ago, it was very common to say that girls should not get too much education. And indeed, about 100 years ago, girls either did not attend schools or they didn't get much more beyond, say, 4th or 5th grade. And why did we say that? Well, some people believe that women belonged in the home, and some people believe that women would compete with men for jobs. But some of you will know that about 100 years ago, there was also a science of the time that was telling us something like this. The mind is connected to the body. And if you mess up with one, you might mess up the other. So if girls got too much education, they might go crazy, they might become ill, they might even become infertile. I know. So today, some of us, we look back and we say, wow, what a strange thought. Like, if you do your homework, you can't have babies. Like, who came up with that, right? But my point is that about 100 years ago, for many people, that was just considered common sense. Yeah? And about 50 years ago, for many people, it was common sense that if you had darker skin, you should not get too much education. And why did we believe that? Well, there are some people who believe that there will be competition for jobs. But some of you will also know that about 50 years ago, there was also a science of that time that was telling us something like this. People with darker skin do not have as much intellectual capacity. They're not as smart. So why should we waste our time and our resources teaching them? Now today, many of us look back and we say, wow, what an incredibly racist thing to say. But my point is that about 50 years ago, for many people, that was just common sense. And I say all of this not to poke fun at people 50 or 100 years ago, but rather to raise the question, 50 years from now, how might we look back and say, oh, I can't believe in 2016 it was commonsensical to think this. What is the common sense of our time that we're not even recognizing is skewing our perceptions of what really is, of what the problems are, and what better solutions might be, right? Why do we run the school year from September to October? Why does the school day run from 8 to 3? Why do we try to squeeze 30 or 40 people in a classroom? Why do we think we should teach 50 minutes of math and 50 minutes of reading and 50 minutes of writing and so on and so forth? Now all of these have historical reasons. We can actually point back in our history and see when these ideas emerged. But as some of you will know, this is not how schools look around the world. These are not necessarily how schools look even in this country throughout time. And this is definitely not how research says schools should look. Common sense is not always informed by research. In fact, common sense is often directly in contradiction to it. This should lead us to ask, what else is commonsensical in education today that we need to be questioning? Now, there are certain ideas regarding the problems and the potential for public education that are so commonsensical that both political parties, both conservatives and Republicans, that everyone seems to be buying into the same story. Our debates are so narrowly defined as to obscure the bigger picture. We seem to be buying into, in other words, only one story. And this reminds me then of the fantastic TED Talk by novelist Chimamanda Adichie called The Danger of a Single Story. And I see some nodding, so many of you are familiar. If you're not familiar, I would encourage you, when you go home tonight, to YouTube Chimamanda Adichie's talk called The Danger of a Single Story. And what she's basically arguing is that any topic is going to have multiple perspectives on it. Any topic is going to be oversimplified if we insist on understanding that topic through only one story. Now, what's the problem? The problem is we often insist that there is only one story. We often insist that my story is the right one. My version of history, my interpretation of this novel, my understanding of a group, even my expectations of the child sitting in front of me. And her challenge to us is to be skeptical anytime we insist that there is only one story, and that story is mine. And this reminder, by the way, this caution applies even to those of us who identify as social justice activists. Because one thing I like to remind us is that sometimes the hardest people that we work with are not those who espouse great hate. It's actually those who pretend to be on our side, or who claim to be advocates of social justice, but who really close the doors off to all other possibilities for that work. So as we then turn to the candidates, let me talk a little bit about the single stories that I think we're hearing from both sides of the aisle. Because although we don't hear much from the top two candidates, we do hear some. Let's talk a little bit about Trump and Clinton. Donald Trump has put out an education platform that centers on school choice. His argument is that, a businessman, right? A monopoly is not a good thing. What we actually need is competition. We need to kind of marketize the system, and it's the competition that's going to drive improvement. and he wants to tie money to it. So part of his school choice plan is something called portability. Portability basically means that school funding follows a student to whatever school they want to go to, including private schools. So this is a way to open the door to privatization. He does not want to put more money in education. He does not support Common Core state standards. Where does Clinton stand? She actually does support the standards. She does support testing. She does support more money, particularly for early childhood. And that makes her different than Trump. But one place where she's similar is that she also supports expanding choice and charter schools. Now, some people like to talk about Trump and Clinton and point out the differences. And I'm not going to deny that there are a lot of differences between Clinton and Trump. However, sometimes it's hard to see, sometimes it's hard to see, though, that there are also a lot of similarities between the top two candidates. And where we see some of the greatest similarities, some of the most obscure similarities, are when we bring in a third party. So let me then talk really briefly about Jill Stein's platform from the Green Party. Stein has put out arguably the most detailed of the platforms, arguably the platform that aligns most closely with progressive organizations. What is she calling for? She's calling for the use of federal funding that equalizes funding across districts. She's calling for free education from pre-K through higher education. Not just less high-stakes testing, but the end of high-stakes testing for students and teachers. Not Common Core, but curriculum developed by educators. Not the shrinking of services by schools, but wraparound services. And the end of privatization. It's when we see a platform like that, that we begin to see that what's being called for by the top two candidates is actually not all that different. Remember, sometimes we need help, sometimes we need a third party, sometimes we need another lens that helps us to rattle the single stories and to rattle common sense. And so what I'd like to do in the remainder of my talk then is to offer three lenses that I would offer for shifting away from single stories. Three lenses for complicating how we understand the context that we're in today and better ways for moving forward. Three lenses, in other words, that shift us from simplistic understandings and simple solutions to complex understandings and more holistic solutions. So these three lenses are moving from single stories to complex pictures, moving from fixing individuals to fixing systems, and then moving from debating policies to demystifying ideologies. So first, from shifting from single stories to complex pictures. So I'm coming from California right now, where one of the things we're talking about is the nationwide teacher shortage. So let me take the so-called teacher shortage as the problem I want to talk about. So lots of kind of crisis language right now in education about how nationwide we're experiencing a shortage. This past fall, California needed to hire 14,000 new teachers. San Francisco alone needed 500 new teachers for the fall. I was interviewed once for, I can't remember if it was television or radio, but the story was about the teacher shortage. And the interviewer began by saying, so this is about salaries and cost of living, right? And I was like, oh, actually that is a part of what's going on. Let me try to explain to you how I make sense of the teacher shortage. So as often happens in interviews, right, you go through 20 minutes of interview and then you watch the story and there's like half a sentence from me and the entire story is about salaries and the expensive housing. And I thought, wow, you so did not need to interview me for this story. But my point is, yeah, we often fixate on only one explanation. When we do that, we are not getting at the full picture, and therefore, we cannot come up with a good solution. Let's talk about how we can understand the teacher shortage. First of all, the teacher shortage is not that new, right? There are always shortages across this country, particularly in certain types of neighborhoods, in certain subject areas, and so on, right? What else is going on? Across the country, we know that salaries do matter, and in San Francisco, where housing prices skyrocket, salaries absolutely do matter. But fueling the cost of living problems is not just gentrification, but the role of the high-tech industry in California, in San Francisco Bay Area. A high-tech industry, for example, that fuels gentrification by offering free buses between high-cost neighborhoods and the Silicon Valley, right? on actually public roads, using public bus stops, and so on. Right? Corporations can fuel gentrification, can fuel the changes in neighborhood development and housing. There's also demographic changes. We are at a time in this nation where the high school population is actually shrinking. We're also at a time when enrollments in teacher prep programs are going down. So it's not just enrollments at the undergrad level that are changing demographically. There's also a shift in the teacher preparation enrollments. Across the nation in the past few years, teacher preparation programs shrunk by about 30%, 3-0. And in California in the past 10 years, enrollment went down by 70%, 7-0. There's very few teachers coming out of programs, and that also can help us to understand why there is a shortage. In California, however, 10 years ago, we also pink slipped. We also gave notice and let go hundreds of teachers, right? Which also fuels the problem. It's not so simple as what some would argue is the retiring baby boomer population. 10, 15 years ago, we knew that right now, there would be a whole bunch of people retiring. But what I would argue is that if that's your only focus, you're also focusing on only one part of the problem. That is part of it, that is not all of it. Let me point to a few more problems, right? We also have punitive policies going on, right? There's this kind of blaming of teachers that's happening. There's restrictive policies that really prevent teachers from teaching. When I talk to teachers who are leaving the profession, they're not actually saying to me that they're leaving because the salaries are too low. That's part of it. But a lot of teachers, especially teachers for social justice who I talk to, are telling me that they're leaving because they feel like with the reforms going on right now, they can't really teach. It's really hard to do social justice teaching in this era of scripted curriculums, high-stakes testing, and punitive policies, right? Some of our solutions to the teacher shortage problem is also making things worse. We're replacing teachers who have 2 or 3 decades in the classroom with teachers who promise to stay only about 2 or 3 years. And then we wonder why the revolving door is increasing and we're seeing even more and more shortages every year. And let's add to that even more. This is a profession that historically is defined by colonialism, by heteropatriarchy. I think of the great work of the scholar Erica Miners, who talks about the role of teaching, how the symbol of the teacher was a highly racialized, gendered image, right, that embodied this colonizing heteropatriarchal role that schools were supposed to be serving. And it's not surprising then, with this as the history, we create policies that compel a white female teaching force through racialized gendered policies, practices, and cultural norms. This is the teacher shortage. It is a combination of all of this, of capitalism, of demographic changes, of deprofessionalization, of the demonizing of teachers, of neoliberalism, of colonialism, of heteropatriarchy, and if you focus on only one aspect of the problem, you're not getting at the full picture, and there's no way you can get at a better solution. Our understanding of education must look at the bigger picture, is my first point. The second lens I want to get at is shifting from fixing individuals to fixing systems. So let me again talk a little bit about California, because we're in a drought. And I don't know if it's the worst drought in history, but it's certainly the worst in our history of water restrictions, right? How we use water. Now, every time we talk about the drought in California, we seem fixated on how individuals can use less. In other words, every time we talk about the drought, we say, and therefore, take shorter showers, and don't run the water as you're brushing your teeth the whole time, and don't water your lawn all the time. Right? It's all about how individuals can consume less water. Does everyone know how much water is consumed by individual households in California? I would ask you to brainstorm, but there's like 1,000-something people in this room, so we won't brainstorm. I'll just give you the answer, which is less than 5%. So less than 5% of water usage in California is accounted for by individual households. Where else is the water being used? Well, there's about I can't remember, but there's about, I don't know, 10 or 12% is being used on almond production, one of the most highly water-intensive crops out there. About 15% is on alfalfa production. Why? Because alfalfa is the primary kind of feed for the largest consumption of water, which is cattle and cow production, that accounts for about 47% of water usage in this country. This reminds me of a fantastic book by Naomi Klein called "This Changes Everything," which argues that climate change is not about individuals going bad. Climate change is actually because of capitalism and corporations running amok in our nation. This reminds me of the film Waiting for Superman, not Waiting for Superman, but it's made by the same person. It was An Inconvenient Truth. Does everyone remember An Inconvenient Truth? So an inconvenient, I know you laugh like yes, I remember. So An Inconvenient Truth actually is very different than Waiting for Superman in some ways. It's actually kind of an interesting film. It features Al Gore. It's all about kind of what's happening with the climate. And for about 99% of that film, I was actually with it. I was like, great film. I need to buy this for my family, right? Until the very end. Does everyone remember how this film ends? So the very last minute or two, there's this black screen with scrolling text that goes up, and it's basically, what can we do about climate change? And it's all the things about how you need to carpool, and you need to take shorter showers, and right? It's all about less individual consumption, even though most of that film was not about individual consumption. It was about how we've structured our economy, we've structured our society so that we're destroying the planet, right? In other words, there's debates, there's these topics that we pick on where we define the problem solely in terms of the individual. We're not looking at structures, we're not looking at systems. And what I would argue is that when we individualize the problem, we're actually masking what's really going on, right? That's happening with the drought, that's happening with climate change, it's also what's happening in education. There was this great study that was done where they kind of talked to people about how do you understand education, how do you make sense of education? And what people would say is that when they think about education, when the words education and schooling comes to mind, there's a particular visual image that comes to mind. And it's the visual image that looks sort of like this, that education is where there's someone at the front, the teacher, who is teaching a whole bunch of people sitting down and listening and absorbing. This is the image that comes into people's minds when you talk about school and education. And so it's not surprising then that when you start talking about the problems in education, or the failures of education, that the problem and the failure gets mapped onto the embodiment of education, the teacher. In other words, how we talk about problems in education is a highly individualized discourse, right? We're not getting at the systems. And they say the way you evaluate teachers is you look at whether or not the student test scores have gone up. They now want to say, how do you evaluate the programs that prepared those teachers? You need to track them for 3 years and see whether or not their student test scores are going up. And if your graduate test scores are not going up, that means your program is not effective. And what's the consequence? That institution is at risk of losing Title IV, federal student financial aid, right? This despite that there's no science that backs up the idea that the way you evaluate a teacher is whether or not test scores are going up, much less the ways that you evaluate a program is whether or not their graduates are raising testing. What are alternatives to high-stakes testing, alternatives to merit pay, alternatives to value-added modeling, alternatives to these problematic teacher prep regulations? It's a conceptual shift from the individual to the system. You know, when the federal government 2 years ago first proposed these regulations, a bunch of teacher educators were saying, this is not how we should evaluate teacher prep programs. We shouldn't look at whether or not their graduates are raising test scores. We should actually look in a more complex way at student learning. Let's look at portfolio assessments of the students to see whether or not they're learning. And I would say it doesn't matter what instrument you choose to figure out whether or not their students are learning. You are still buying into the story that the way you evaluate a teacher prep program is you look at individual performance. If we really buy into the story that it takes a village to raise a child, what we actually need to be doing is not pretending that there is no village. What we actually need to be doing is seeing the degree and the way in which the teacher contributes to that village. That's what we should be assessing. That's how we determine teacher effectiveness, right? We need to shift our narrative from being the best in the world to it takes a village. There's so much language around economic competitiveness. There's so much language around we need to have the best system in the world. I was talking to one of my teacher colleagues who was like, I didn't sign up for that. I didn't sign up to like teach my kid to beat out every other kid that's out there. Like, that's not my goal. Right? Because now everything seems to be about college and career readiness, economic competitiveness, best in the world. And I would say, you know, there are some people who would talk about education as central to freedom. Education is central to liberation. Education is central to kind of empowerment and social change. This is how we talked about schools in the freedom school movement of the civil rights movement. This is how we talked about schools, by the way, when you talked to people who were either enslaved or formerly enslaved over a century ago. Different communities do think about the promises of education and schooling very differently. And that's the conversation that we need to be having. And again, the third point I want to make is that we need to shift from debating policy to demystifying ideologies. And here, let me talk about the one point that the one policy issue that I said already that Trump and Clinton agree on, and that is choice and charter schools. Let's try to complicate how we think about choice, and the way that I want to do that is by pointing to perhaps an unlikely suspect. Let me say a little bit about international economic policy, because here's where we begin to see some very interesting origins of our reliance on choice. So, during the Cold War, right, the US dominated many of the global financial institutions, and led by thinkers from the University of Chicago, the United States began to put forward a policy for what economic development should look like in struggling nations. So in the 40s, but particularly 50s and 60s, and this is documented in the great books by things like Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, or the great works by Noam Chomsky and folks like that, what they point to is how nation after nation, as they were facing economic turmoil, they turned to the global financial institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, even the US Treasury, and all of these institutions would say, we'll give you some financial assistance if you radicalize your markets. In other words, if you move your economy to a free market system, right? You deregulate, in other words. And what we see time and again is that this so-called radical deregulation led to a greater wealth gap than ever before. Great, very commonsensical, very commonplace. And we began, therefore, to be so confident in this as the reform framework that we were applying to education as well. So what we see in the 1970s is that as countries in Latin America began to face economic turmoil, we would threaten to not give financial assistance unless they not only deregulated their economy, but also deregulated their educational system. And what we see is that the countries that had some of the highest, almost universal literacy rates, some of the highest literacy rates in the world, plummeted within years. Why? Because we marketized those systems, right? And why should this be a surprise? A competition, a market, has winners and losers. And we should therefore expect that if you marketize a system, you are necessarily creating a system where there will be losers, and there will be a lot of them. What gives the muscle behind what will become this neoliberal ideology is a movement. Because this is how I began my talk, right? Ideas don't become commonplace because you have some great leader pushing it. Ideas become commonsensical because there's a social movement behind it. And what was the social movement that drove these kinds of ideologies? It was the movement that took birth in the early 1970s in this country, and that is the conservative movement, right? And the conservative movement built up this incredible framework of think tanks and foundations and advocacy arms and media arms, because they knew that their job was not merely to change policy, it was to change how we think, and they wanted to structure that kind of conceptual change. Now, to change law and policy, right? And so the goal was to create a social movement that would similarly change law and policy. And by the 1980s, these ideas of kind of deregulation and so on became so commonplace that there's a name for it. We call it the Washington Consensus, right? Which means that both political parties, Democrats and Republicans, believed that neoliberal thought was the way to restructure any system, economic, education, healthcare, and so on. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because neoliberalism was a counter not only to civil rights broadly, but even civil rights movements within education. Because as we were doing things like desegregation in the civil rights movement in this country, what was the policy lever that people who were opposing desegregation put forward as the counter? It was school choice. right? It was during the civil rights movement that many were saying, we don't need mandatory desegregation programs, we just need school choice programs. Because if you have school choice, that will naturally desegregate things, right? Even though what we see time and again is that school choice programs can actually exacerbate segregation. Vouchers also took birth in the midst of the response to the civil rights movement. Vouchers as a way to improve educational equality for all. Vouchers was seen by economic thinkers